Hey, Sean. I do a lot of videos for clients that are entirely based on interviews. Like the whole narrative of the video is the speaking of different executives or leaders or clients, representatives of these organizations, these brands, these companies. And videos like this go a long way to really driving home authenticity, because it's not a voiceover, it's not something scripted or something you're making your viewer read on screen, but it really is just the genuine musings of people who are associated with that organization. So it's a powerful platform, but these can be really difficult to edit, because when you record an interview, you're going to record a 15, 20, 25, 45-minute video, and then you're going to do that to, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 people, and you have to boil down those hours of footage into like a 3 to 5 minute video. And so I wanted to walk through the process that I use to making sure that I can do this really quickly for my clients and get a really, really good product for them when it starts with something as sort of vague and general as these interviews can be. To begin, the first thing you need to do before we get into the editing is conduct the interview. There's a few things that go a really long way to making sure that the interview is very useful for you later on. My first little tip is to have the person on camera say and spell their first and last name as well as their title. Because a lot of times I've got notes from clients or things are, pulled from emails, and there'll be a name spelled wrong. And so rather than trust anyone else, when you've got the person sitting there, just have them on camera say and spell their name. I'm Sean Haudley, S-H-A-U-N, H-A-U-T-L-Y. And then I've got the footage of them saying it so that I can make sure that I spell everyone's name correctly and put in their proper current title according to them. 2, slate. Slate all of your stuff. If you've got a slate, great. If not, just do a 3, 2, 1. Clap, have them do it, you can do it. But do this so that you can easily sync all of your cameras and your audio later on much faster. And lastly, and this is a big one that is its own whole separate video or article or whatever, but as you conduct these interviews, make sure that you're thinking of your final video already. You know what the project's going to be, and so making sure that you have an opening that sort of describes generally what the organization is, making sure you hit the bullet points of, whatever their offerings, products, services may be, and then a good beat to end on that sort of sums things up if there's a call to action. You know what these pieces are going to be, and so you need to reverse engineer your questions that you ask to these different interviewees. You need to reverse engineer them and create questions that are going to lead them to the answers that you know you will need to actually get a video together. I've edited footage for other people, and I've had interviews where I've forgotten this or it hasn't happened perfectly, and you end up sitting staring at the video wishing you could finish it, but no one says like, and that's why you should always use us, or some cliche happy note to sit on for the video to end with. And so make sure ahead of time that you have your notes to make sure you get those little sound bites, those clips, whatever it is you need from the different people so that you can piece this all together later. So you've filmed your interviews at this point, and now I'm going to walk through my process from camera to first draft, how I go through my process. And I pride myself, and my process is pretty quick. I've honed it over lots of years of doing this type of video. And so I use Final Cut Pro. I use Final Cut Pro because it's better than Premiere in every way that I've seen. Premiere has a lot of institutional memory and a lot of momentum, but it's also expensive and buggy, and Final Cut's just a better program, and if you want to argue about it, let's do so in the comments, because I've tried them both and it's just so good. So before I bring any of my footage into Final Cut, the first thing that I do is back everything up twice. Lately I've been using a program called Shotput Pro, and Shotput Pro does checksum verification to make sure that as you copy your files from your camera to a hard drive, that they're not slightly corrupted or little bits are missing. I've had frames dropped. I've had issues really only in like the past year, and this caused me to start using a checksum verification program. But Shotput Pro is what I use. So first thing I do is I back up all my footage, and in that process, I also name my footage based on whatever camera it is. So all my files from my A7 III are going to have A7 III in the file name. All of my files from my A7S II, from my Zoom F4, any different camera, any different recorder that gets used, I'm going to make sure that those clips are named appropriately as I back them up. Now, when it comes time to actually importing them, I import all my footage into a Final Cut project, and then the first thing I do is I highlight any clip that has anything to do with the interviews, any audio or video from the interviews, and I create a new event in Final Cut, and I call that event Interview Components. So I'm going to be using a project from Union, Missouri, and a project one of my clients did at their high school to update all of their lighting and HVAC and stuff. And so you can see I've got this first event where I dumped everything, and then I dragged all of the interview files. There's 4 interviews, and so there are 16 files. There's 2 cameras, and then I recorded 2 audio files out of my F4, one at 1 level and one at about 12 decibels below that, just in case somebody talked real loud or something. I still had good, safe audio. So for all of these clips, I'm going to make multicam clips. And there's other ways to sync audio and make compound clips and stuff. A multicam clip becomes really easy to edit later on, and so I stick with multicam clips, and getting them right in the beginning is important. So first thing I do is I highlight the 4 clips that I know are this first guy's interviews, and I'll right click and I'll do a new multicam clip. But before I do this, you can see over here in the inspector, there's a field for camera name. Now, all of my interviews for this project are less than 30 minutes long, which means that on my mirrorless cameras with their 30-minute file limit, I didn't have to have any interviews that lasted with the same person 2 video clips. So all of my clips for these are single clips from each camera or each source. If I have longer interviews, I always go through and I name all the cameras in Final Cut, and that's for this reason here. So when I click to do a new multicam clip, it brings up this dialog, and I always name this sync 1 or 2, 3, etc. And I make sure it goes in the event interview components. This use audio for synchronization, I have never had an issue with this working as long as I've slated my clips. Even a clap or a slate, whatever, if in the beginning of your clips you do your 3, 2, 1, and you spike the audio for all your devices, this use audio for synchronization works perfectly every time. Then this next drop down, I'm going to keep it on clips because, like I said, all these, each source has a single clip. There's no camera angle that has 2 clips to it. So I can organize this by clip, but I could also go to camera name if I had multiple clips from the same camera, and it would make sure that each track is going to be keeping all the clips from the same cameras in those tracks. So I'm going to keep it on clips. And then your video format, even if your final video is going to be 1080p, a lot of times I click this to 4K if I have 4K footage, because what that does is if, say, like my wide is a 4K that I want to be able to crop in on later, making sure that your multicam clip has your full resolution in it is important. So always put this to whatever the max resolution of your clips is and your frame rate, and then click OK. So when you click OK, it's going to churn through, it's going to synchronize the angles based on that audio, and it's going to lay it out into a multicam clip, which is sort of a specialized compound clip in Final Cut Pro. And I'll show you here when we open it that all our tracks are going to be laid out from top to bottom. So here's sync 1. And when I click on this, here you can see my 4 tracks, and I'll shrink these down just a tiny bit. So you can see my 4 tracks. I've got my 2 audio tracks, one of which has a D for dual channel recording. That's my one that's lower, and you can see it. Everything matches up with the waveforms. It's just a lot quieter on this one. But you can see here where this one peaks a little bit, starts to get into the yellow. I've got a safe version that's right where I want it to be down here. But what I do each time I start one of these is I drag the clips. I like to put my wide at the top and my tight just underneath it. And then if you had a camera name, that will be here instead of this file name. But because I didn't do camera names, I'm going to come in here, click this, call it wide, click this, call it tight. And I could name these if I wanted to, but because I only had a single mic for these, I'm not. If I had a lapel and a overhead, I would name those appropriately. And you'll see where that comes into play in just a minute. But then the next thing I always do is I come in here and I make sure that their first little question is the name and spelling. And if I listen,
Steve Weinhold, S-T-E-V-E-W-E-I-N-H-O-L-D.
Steve Weinhold. And so I come here and I name this Dr. Steve Weinhold. And what that does is it makes sure that every time this clip gets used throughout the project, I know I've got the name spelled properly according to exactly how they spelled it on camera. And it goes a long way to making sure that we're organized and that things are how they should be. So I do this for each one of the interviews, and you can see I've done that here where I've got all 4 interviews named properly, and inside any of them you can see I've got my wide, I've got my tight, and then I've got my 2 audio clips below that. And then the next step is the first step in really starting to hone the content. This was all prep work up until this point. Now, to start honing that content, I make a new project, a new timeline, and if you're 4K later or whatever, this doesn't really matter, but I always call this interview scratch. I don't know why I started using that, but that's what I call it. So I'm going to call it interview scratch 1, click OK, and it's going to make me a nice blank timeline. And then I take all 4 clips and I'm pressing E, which is an append edit, where it just puts the full clip right at the end. And if I zoom out here, you'll see that now I have got a timeline with all 4 interviews spread out upon this timeline. Now this next step, I'm doing 2 things at the same time. This first pass through the footage, I'm both cutting out any dead space, anything that's not usable, like when I'm asking a question in the interview, when they're thinking, if something happens and everyone's distracted, anything that isn't them giving a good answer, I'm going to delete. And you can see here in the waveforms, as I zoom in, you can see sort of these breaks in the questions. And I know that that's when they're not talking. You can see there in the video, it's when they're not talking, and then when the waveforms are up, they are talking. So I'm going to use that to speed this process along a little bit. But the other thing that I'm doing at the same time is I'm listening for highlights. I'm listening for those clips that I may have taken notes on while I was doing the interviews, or I may have just remembered like, oh, when they say this part, that I really wanted that to be the last thing of the video. So anything like that, I'm going to cut out and lift out of the storyline onto a secondary storyline right above it. There's 3 little tricks that I like to use as I go through this process to just make it a little easier and a little faster. First, you can press the L button to start playing your footage, and if you press it again, it'll play at double time, and if you press it again, even faster than that, but it starts to be hard to hear dialogue at that point. But if I click L here,
well, mine was just recommendation.
If I hit L again,
final thing obviously comes down to the bigger package of what I'm part of, as far as can you do the job, can you do what you say you're going to do, what's the cost, what's the time frame, all those things.
So that's going to be really handy as I have 4 hours of footage to go through. That's going to make it take 2 hours, which is a huge difference. And for this dialogue, a lot of it you've heard already, and you know the pieces you're looking for. If there's multiple takes of the same question or the same answer, you probably know the last one's the good one. And so once you hear a couple of those, you can skim through them even faster. So I play it at double speed. I also come over here to my viewer preferences, and I make them a little taller, and if I click over here, I can make my waveforms even bigger. And so this makes it really obvious where these people are talking and where they're not. And so as I go through this visually, here I can see this is a solid answer right there with questions and stuff in between it. So I'm going to use that to make this process even faster of just cutting this whole interview scratch project down to just the usable clips from the process. And the third and final little thing that I use is if you come to the beginning, if you haven't worked with multicam clips before, it's really easy and kind of fun. But if you press Command-Shift-7, it's going to pull up your viewer. And I'm actually going to get rid of my browser here. But you can see the 2 angles here. And if we go in a little bit, I've got my wide and my tight named appropriately there. And you can see these sort of tabs down here. I've got 2 pages of angles. And I could actually in here set it to 4 angles and see all 4 camera angles, and there we got 1, 2, 3, 4. But this is why we lay it out in order in that clip, and why I like to put the wide and tight at the top, especially if I have other things opening. I can set this to 2 angles, and I know that those top 2 angles are going to be on the same page. If they're not, then you sort of, to make your cuts, you're clicking back and forth. And then the one little trick to making sure that you don't make a really easy and common mistake is you see these 3 little buttons here at the top of your multicam window. We've got video, audio, and then this one on the left is video and audio. As you play one of these projects, if you click these buttons, if you click, so you can see the video here is on wide. If I click tight, it's going to put a cut down here in my timeline, and now we're using that tight. And as I keep playing, I can click up here again, and now I'm using that one. And this little process here, let me get rid of that. This little process goes a long way to making your cuts easier, where you can, you know, cut just between words based on your waveform, so that way as you're watching it, it's switching the pace up for your viewer a little bit. But where the little problem can be is if you have this first one clicked, the video and audio, what it's going to do, and I'm going to pull this up to 4 angles so you can see the audio here too, but I've got my audio sourced in all these clips from this bottom one, my main audio. But if I have it set to audio and video, when I do make this cut, it's going to actually start pulling the audio from this camera angle, which I don't want. That's the in-camera audio. If I click over here, it's going to bring the audio from that. And you can see my waveform down here shrinks because it's that tiny little built-in microphone. And so I make sure that as I do these, let me undo all these little cuts. As I do these, I go to the beginning of the clip and I make sure that my audio, I'm cutting from the main track, and my video, I'm going to cut here from the tight. And as soon as we get started, I'll probably switch to the wide. And then I make sure that it's on this video one so that as I cut back and forth, I don't start using the audio from one of these built-in cameras. So here goes. I'm going to go through the first minute here with you watching. And I know this is all just the sound check and boring stuff. That's me talking. So I know I don't need that. And here's Final Cut's fantastic magnetic timeline that's going to make cleaning this whole project up really simple.
I'm a superintendent of schools for Union 11 School District. This is my 4th year as the superintendent. I worked here prior.
So this little segment here, oops. So this little segment here is him answering the question of what is your title. And while that's important to me because I need it to put his title on screen, it's not going to be in the video. So I'm actually going to make sure I delete all of that too. And I'm looking for his first usable answer.
In 1984, I played football, basketball, I was receiver, and defensive back. What was this project? Why? The reason we started the project was...
So here's when he starts talking about the project. And so I'm going to put my playhead just before that. I'm going to use a little keystroke called Option Open Bracket, which is going to cut everything before the playhead of this clip up to the playhead. So now my project starts with his first answer.
The reason we started the project was...
And I can, if I wanted to, listen to his whole answer and listen for the highlights, but I can also come to the end where I can see his waveform start to trail off.
Have a better facilities for our constituents.
And I'm going to press Command B, which is going to blade, which is going to split that clip into 2 clips. And then I can use that same keystroke again when I see that he's about to have another answer, Option Open Bracket, and it's going to trim from the beginning of this clip here up to the playhead, but it won't trim anything before this clip. So here's my Option Bracket, and it gets rid of that space in between. And the other way you can do it, you can just come through here, and when I see that there's nothing happening, I can drag and just press delete, or you can use the blade tool, press B, make your 2 little cuts, click A for the select tool, and delete that. That's all we're doing. There's just a couple different ways to do it, but I'm going to go through here, and any time that he's not talking is footage I'm not going to use, and I'm going to delete that. At the same time, I'm also going to be listening to these clips.
We did those for about probably a week, just checking with the students, asking the teachers for feedback as well, just see what it was like to come in there every day, then you go to a room that didn't have it, and it could really tell us the difference when you're coming into rooms with the new LED lights, correct?
Using the P tool, which if we look at our tools here, so you can see these, we've used the select tool, we've used the range selection tool if we wanted to delete a range, we've used the blade tool, the split clips into multiple clips, but the P tool is sort of the override for the magnetic timeline. And so you can see if I use the select tool and lift this clip out, that bottom clip slides in to fill the gap. And that's not what I want right now. And so if I use the P tool and slide this clip upward, it's going to put an automatic gap underneath there. so that nothing is going to play at the same time as this, but now you can see that this clip I've separated from the rest of the timeline. And so I'm going to go through, and anytime I've got a clip as I listen to these, let's say that this clip here is important to me. I'm going to use that same tool, and so at the end of this project, I'm going to have none of these gaps in here, and I'm going to have all of my clips that I think are really important lifted above the primary storyline to the secondary storyline. And so that's my first step, and I'm going to go through and do this entire clip for you, and we're going to come back in a second. You'll see that all the gaps are gone, and I've got a handful of clips lifted up above that I know are my good, usable, happy clips. See ya in just a second. So here we are, we have the interview scratch project with all of the gaps cut out. And what that does when you cut out the gaps is I also know as I zoom in here that anywhere there's a cut, these are all sort of complete, full answers. And it's really easy to shuffle things around and to listen and to know, like, this is the part where he talks about this is the part where she talks about that. And I can use that later to make editing very easy. So I always, even if there's sort of two answers before I've asked another question, and so there's no gap, I'll just sort of cut the different clauses at this point into different clips. And then again, any clip that I really like that I know I'm going to use, I'm going to lift out. So I can look through here and I can see that, you know, from the first interview, I've got a handful of clips that are lifted out, a lot in the beginning especially. From the second interview, I've got a handful lifted out. Not a ton from this third interview. And then a couple from this last interview. And so my next step is I create a new project, and I'm going to make sure that my resolution is full resolution. So if I was 4K, this is when I would use 4K. But I'm going to go ahead and call this one Draft 1. Now the reason I call it Draft 1 is that you'll see as we start to do some things shortly that when you duplicate timelines and projects in Final Cut, if the last character is a number, it'll automatically increment that number by 1. So if I duplicate this project shortly, which I will, it'll automatically name it Draft 2, and so on and so on. So I'm going to call this Draft 1, and now I've got a brand new empty project. So I'm going to go back one timeline, and I'm going to use the A tool, the Select tool, and I'm going to select all of these clips that I've lifted out of the timeline, and I'm going to copy them. I'm going to leave them there. And the reason I do this and not, you know, drag them or delete anything, I'm going to come in here to Draft 1. I'm going to paste them. But the reason I do it this way is so that if at any point during this I deleted a clip and I'm like, oh, that was such a good clip, I don't have to go back through all the footage and find it. I know that I can come back here into Interview Scratch and pull it from the top again, and I haven't been destructively editing anything. So when I come in here to Draft 1, I've pasted everything, and it pastes it on top of this gap that it creates so it can keep the timing. But I'm actually going to just drag everything to the end, which is going to get rid of those gaps, and then delete this big thing. And now here are all of my highlighted clips. These are all the things that I pulled out of that first run through. And what I find a lot of times, and why it's important to really get that first run through right, is that look at this time. With just these usable clips that I picked out, we have 8 minutes and 47 seconds of usable footage. And the problem with that is that my final video can only be, in this particular instance, 3 minutes long, maybe 3.5 minutes long. Like, this has to be quick. And so now I have just the best usable clips, and I know that I need to further hone this down to be shorter and more concise. And so this is when I start liberally making cuts to get this number from 847 down. Now, depending on my mood sometimes, just to keep things clean, I'll go ahead and duplicate this project and start working in Draft 2 as I'm going to start deleting things. But since all we really did, and we left the interview scratch with all of its clips untouched up top, I'm going to go ahead and delete things here, and if later I need to go back, again, I know they're right in the top of that interview scratch timeline. But so the next thing I do here is I find my opening lines, and I start dragging them around. So let's say, for example, this is the clip I remember that really had that good opener. And then this long project description is just too long. Somebody explains it better later. I'm going to pull this clip here, which is him explaining some details of the project. Here's the athletic director talking. So I'm going to start going through here and saying, you know, this is just too long of a clip here. He says some great things, but there's just, as I highlight this clip, you can see the time of this clip is actually a full minute that he's talking. And in a 3-minute video, I can't have one person talking that isn't a description of the project here for a third of that video. So I may go in here, I may zoom in and maybe cut out part of this. And I know I'm doing this indiscriminately for this example, but as I do this, when I actually do it for clients, I'm going through and I'm listening for things and I'm saying, can we live without that? Does someone else say that better? Does he say that better? And so I just start going through here, deleting things, shuffling things around. If I know that I've got, you know, this is the last clip. There's a little actually of this guy where he didn't grow up in the school district, but he works there now. And so
I am. Even though I started out being a Blue Jay and all my kids are Blue Jays, I am proud to be a Wildcat.
So I think that's a funny, cute little clip. I'm going to make sure that I drag that to the end of the project. We'll say that this is just too long here. This one's too long. We'll break these up a little bit. We'll take that out. And so I start to look at this first draft and I say, you know, now we're down to 4 minutes and 22 seconds. And depending on the client and how involved they want to be and how much they're trusting me to do my job, sometimes I do send a project at this point to the client to say, you know, it's too long right now, but I want to know what's important to you. Like maybe some of the things that I think are lighthearted and resonate with their viewers, they may say, actually, some of these more technical things, we want to make sure we keep those bullet points in there. And so I may at this point send this project for approval to the client. I may sit on it for a day or show it to somebody, get some extra thoughts on it. But so here is that first draft. The next stage is just sort of repeating this, where I'm going to come up here to my first draft. I'm going to duplicate the project, and you can see that now, again, it automatically names it draft 2. I'm going to double click this to open it. And here's that project, 4 minutes and 22 seconds. And this is just when I'm going to go in again, and I'm going to start to hone things maybe based on some client feedback. They may want something else sort of in the beginning of the video. They may have hated my little cute ending that I liked. But so now I've got it down to a 2 minute and 56 second interview, which is underneath the 3-minute mark where I want it. And from here, then I can start to really add some things. So typically with these sort of videos, before I put all my B-roll on, I do get the narrative approved by the client. I tell them, you know, close your eyes if you want to and just listen to it. Make sure it hits the points you want it to hit in the order that you want it to hit. And before I take the time to sort of do an intro and time the B-roll, and as they're talking about one thing, having a clip of it on screen, before I do any of that, I always have the client approve it because it's really obnoxious to do all that work, send it to the client, and then for them to be like, actually, that whole section, we don't want to hear that actually, or something changed and now that's not relevant, so get rid of it. So before I go through any of that work, I always send it to the client and get approval. So let's say this does get approved. The next thing I do is I duplicate the project. So now we've got draft 3 up there. Double click that, open it in the timeline. And here's when I'll start to go through and actually make some B-roll, put an intro, the end cards, the information that I know, start to put their titles on the screen. But this is where this multicam clip really comes in handy, where if I start to zoom in, I'm going to actually watch this for a second. And actually, this is going to be funny because I didn't make the cuts with any actual discernment, so I don't know what the narrative is going to sound like. But I'm going to go through here and start to cut between the camera angles just to make it so that I know I'm going to cover this with B-roll, a lot of it, but any part that I don't have a relevant clip to cover or that it makes sense to just let them talk more, I'm just going to break it up a little bit. I'm going to use the indications in the waveform to help me make good cuts between the tight and the wide to keep things moving a little bit. So we'll listen to this first minute here at double speed.
Right now we're saving at least $4,000 to $5,000 a month in electric bills on these facilities. We have over 400 employees, 3,100 students on average. So there's a lot of room for energy waste if we can't get a handle on that.
What I'm going to do here is I'm going to come to the beginning of Mike's clip, and you can see in my active monitor over here, this is what people are actually seeing on the far right. I go from him talking to this guy talking, and it's a really similar frame between those two. So just to make it a little bit more visually appealing, I'm going to actually cut to the tight. So the first shot we see of Dr. Mike is the tight, and that way when we watch this, if we watch the preview monitor over here,
We have over 400.
It makes a little bit, it's more of a transition, which is a little bit easier to watch. At this time, I also come in here and I start to cut out the beginnings and ends of these clips a little bit to make sure it's a smooth transition from one to the other.
We have over 400 employees, 3,100 students on average.
And at this point, I may want to cut to this wide, so now we're looking like this.
We have over 400 employees, 3,100 students on average. So there's a lot of room for...
And actually, I may use that little breath he takes as I'm switching cameras here. I'm going to cut out that breath so it flows just a little bit faster. And let's see now without that breath if it's nicer.
Average. So there's a lot of room for energy waste if we can't get a handle on that. I've been to many schools, this one included. You come in here at night and it's lit up like a Christmas tree.
One of the other nice things about editing with a multicam clip, or really editing with two cameras, is that you can cut out little pieces and sew them together using these camera switches. So let's say I wanted to cut out here where he says, including this one. So here's the full clip.
I've been to many schools, this one included. You come in here at night and it's lit up like a Christmas tree.
If I wanted to get rid of him saying this one included, I'm going to put a cut right there.
I've been to many schools, I've been to many schools, this one.
So here's where he says this one included. I'm going to cut there.
You come in.
And I'm going to cut here. And when I take this clip out, I'm also going to switch the camera angles. And so even though I don't think his words are going to make sense for this example, you can see that just using this cut, I cut out a whole section and was able to shorten the video even a little bit, but also omit something that I didn't want him saying.
I've been to many schools. You come in here at night and it's lit up like a Christmas tree, and there's one custodian that's working in an area.
So that's one of the nice things about multicam clips, and even if you don't have two cameras, if you shoot in 4K, you can then artificially crop in if you have a 1080 project still at full resolution, which is what I'm doing here. Every clip you've seen, there's just one camera, but it's shooting in 4K. And so every time I make a cut, I can zoom in a little bit and it's going to look like a second camera. But it's a great way, rather than have something jump in the same frame where you can tell that the only thing that's really moving is the person, by switching the camera, we can hide some of these cuts. And I do this a lot to take out when they say and and ah, and I probably should do it to myself in these videos. But with these interviews, I go through and I can cut out long pauses and ums and ers. Some of it I may just cover with B-roll, but some of it I may switch camera angles if I want them on screen making that point. So actually, before I send that full draft of the narrative to the client, I do typically go through and make these camera angle cuts just so that as they watch this full narrative without any B-roll, it does stay a little bit more exciting and they're not as hung up on like, oh my gosh, this person's been on screen for a long time. By cutting back and forth between camera angles, it can go a long way to making it seem like the video has a faster pace than it does, which makes it easier for the viewer to watch. So that's my process for going through, starting with a ton of interview footage and boiling down to just the small parts. I know there's ways where you can go through and highlight and use keywords and favorites and use in and out points in your interview footage to say, you know, this part, this part, this part. This is the fastest way I find where I can keep coming back to it and seeing just these different milestones of places where I've made cuts or gathered footage, and I can always step back a couple steps and get things that I may have deleted and want to bring back. But I never have to just go through all the footage again because I've taken the step to get rid of all the pauses once, and I never have to listen to those again. And then I've taken a step to pull out my favorites, and I never have to listen to the bad takes again. So that's my process for actually doing interview-based video editing. So if you have any questions, if you have any tips, if you do anything differently, if anything isn't working for you in Final Cut, feel free to throw a comment down below, ask a question. I hope this was helpful. This is what I do all the time. Most of my projects are this sort of project, and so I've fallen in love with this process. It's very fast for me, and I continue to tweak it a little bit every single time I do it, even though I've done it hundreds of times. So always keep learning, always keep honing, and if you learn something, share it with me. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you later.